Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Mathis Show. An awful lot to get to in the next 30 minutes here. Some broadcasting notes real quick, just so you know. Starting tomorrow, the Jimmy Mathis Show podcast will be available every day, Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. over at jimmymathislive.com. The big news coming out of Washington, D.C. last week was the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown. This is probably old news at this point because it has exhausted a 72-hour news cycle, but since it is a lifetime appointment, I would like to spend a little bit of time on it. I'm going to preface this with the way that I thought Senator Lindsey Graham handled the situation was absolutely despicable. I thought he cheapened the entire narrative from the confirmation process. I thought that it looked self-serving. I thought it was disrespectful to Justice Brown. However, I don't think it had anything to do with racism. Now, this whole thing, whether you like it or not, was cloaked in racism from the very beginning by POTUS, by President Biden. There were stipulations on who would be appointed based on their gender and on their race alone. Now, this is being championed right now as some massive win for the Democratic Party, and specifically Joe Biden, at least from those in the media. I'm simply not seeing it. Right now, Joe Biden is polling at roughly 43%. They're talking about bringing prosecution against Donald Trump on this January 6th thing. Trump is polling at 46%. Now, we're going to get into some of the tricks that are being used right now to help to prop up the president's approval ratings. One of them is President Barack Obama coming to the White House. Again, not making any sense to me. But again, the confirmation of this justice, does this really do anything for the Republican Party, this glass ceiling that they have allegedly broken through? First of all, it seems somewhat ridiculous. Keep in mind, it was a female black vice president that oversaw the proceedings to begin with. How historic is this anymore? Now listen, was Justice Brown more than qualified to serve on the high court? The answer is unequivocally yes. A federal judge. She definitely has the credentials to be a Supreme Court justice, but that is not the purpose of these confirmation hearings. Purpose is, does she have the judicial temperament to be a Supreme Court justice? And I thought that Lindsey Graham lost that argument by going off the rails, reverting back to the days of the Judge Kavanaugh hearings. The two have nothing to do with each other, trying to frame this individual as though somehow she supports pedophilia. He came across looking very, very petulant through the entire proceedings. Meanwhile, not talking about what the other underlying issue should have been, which is her methodology when it comes to ruling, mainly on originalism. And this is important, ladies and gentlemen, because the role of the Supreme Court has significantly changed over the years. It is getting more and more involved in the culture wars that's being shoved down our throat. That is what is ending up in the high court. And that is why when Ms. Brown was asked, can you describe what a woman is, she was sort of tripping over herself on it. She did not want to paint herself in a corner because she realizes it is those issues and those issues alone that are going to end up on the high court in the very near future. And by Lindsey Graham flying off to Pluto on going back to the Brett Kavanaugh days and trying to label her as somebody that is sympathetic to child pedophiles, never able to make that argument. And even if he was doing it for self-serving reasons, what did he get out of it? Other than looking what I believe is fairly foolish. Now, the problem with the way this judge views her role on the high court, again, it got very little attention because we were too busy talking about pedophilia and Brett Kavanaugh, is she originalist when it comes to the way that she views her role on the high court? Meaning, does she look at the case in front of her and go back to the Constitution as it is written, word for word? Or, as a Supreme Court justice, is she going to try to interpret the Constitution to fit the time right now? Obviously, there was no way for the Founding Fathers to know what kind of society we would be living in hundreds of years later. The problem with this is the Constitution is a living, breathing document. It's been amended 27 times. Things like the right to vote for women, for African Americans, the freeing of the slaves, the 13th Amendment. It has been amended to keep up with a changing country. Question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we want justices to be doing that on the fly from the bench, or does it need to go through the legislative process as it was originally intended by the founders? And that is a core question that should have been asked during these confirmation hearings that got little attention. The problem that I have with this, ladies and gentlemen, it's nothing against Miss Brown personally, but if she is not an originalist, what that means is that she is going to interpret the Constitution through her privy of the way the founders would view it if they were here today, which means that de facto, the Supreme Court is now turning into a legislative body. And whatever side of the political divide you may be on, can you agree that there has been just sort of this muddying of the waters when it comes to separation of power? We see it all the time with executive orders through the executive branch. Now we're seeing it with the Supreme Court that is beginning to replace the role of Congress, which is playing that role of a legislative branch. We see it with federal agencies up and down Constitution Avenue, where they are creating law through rules and regulations. Now, you may have a difference of opinion on the judicial prudence of a Supreme Court justice. I do believe, personally, as a constitutional conservative, that the justice needs to view the Constitution basically word for word. And if the Constitution does not keep up with the times we are living in right now, then sure, that needs to be rectified as it has in the past. But it needs to happen through a constitutional amendment and not through the views and opinions of 9 justices. A very busy week also, ladies and gentlemen. President Barack Obama at the White House doing a little bit of a prep rally, if you will. Significant. His first time back at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue since he left. The purpose of him visiting Washington and Joe Biden was, like I said, for it to kind of be a pep rally, as we talked about in the previous segment. Joe Biden right now is hurting very much with his approval rating. He is right now polling under Donald Trump. This is with Donald Trump, who hasn't been in the White House for several years, still in the national news in a very negative way, at least from the media. I'm not exactly sure what the end game here was. I'm not sure how putting the presidency of Joe Biden next to a very charismatic Barack Obama helps Biden. And if you saw the video from last week, it did not do that. Actually, Biden moseying around by himself looked lost in his own house. If anything, I think it portrayed Joe Biden in a position of weakness and definitely did not make him look very presidential. As we were talking about at the beginning of the show, the confirmation of the first female black justice, is that enough to give any significant bump to Joe Biden? Absolutely not. And his predecessor coming to town, I'm not sure that's going to help much either. What you have right now is a disaster when it comes to foreign policy. It goes way beyond Ukraine, by the way. That's just what everybody's focusing on. You also have what is becoming a more and more anemic economy. You have hyperinflation, supply chain issues, and you do have real issues when it comes to employment, however they want to bastardize these unemployment numbers. President Barack Obama at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It was interesting what he decided to talk about, at least I thought it was. Mr. President, go.
I think it's been well documented just how difficult it was to pass the ACA. You can get a lot of testimony here in case folks haven't heard. You know, as a country, we have been talking about reforming healthcare for 100 years. Unlike almost every other advanced economy on earth, we didn't have a system that guaranteed access to healthcare for all of its citizens. Millions of people didn't have health insurance, often because their employers didn't provide it or because it was too expensive. But despite the fact that our healthcare system didn't work well, it was hard to change.
Yeah, it was very hard to change because a majority of Americans didn't want it. I thought it was an interesting thing to come to Washington to tout. He is correct, by the way. The Democrats have been trying to get the nationalization of our healthcare system done for 100 years. Haven't been able to do it for one simple reason. America didn't want it, which is why President Barack Obama didn't run on it. He ran on being a unifier. He ran on hope and change. The whole taking over 20% of the American economy came after he was elected, after he was sworn in. Also, ladies and gentlemen, if you remember, he spent all of his political capital to get that thing done. And it was a colossal failure. Tens of millions of people that had health insurance were driven onto Medicaid. The website itself was a failure. The cost of health care actually went up. Tort reform was not included in it. Doctors have left the practice. And this is his big achievement that he's going to come to Washington, D.C. and wave the banner on. Here's the thing, whether you're looking at President Barack Obama or you're looking at Donald Trump, they both ran on positive messages, and you can hate Donald Trump all you want, but the simple message was make America great again. Barack Obama obviously ran on hope and change. Well, do any of these things matter? Whatever you want them to, it doesn't really matter. The problem that Biden's running into right now is not only does he have a disaster foreign policy, not only does he have an anemic economy with the exception of Wall Street and the real estate market, but when it comes to Main Street, majority of Americans are hurting very much. He also has no message. There is no positive message that is being disseminated from this White House. And even when he has a glimmer of one, like with the confirmation of Justice Brown, it's framed in the negative. This has never happened. We're a racist country. We're misogynistic, even though I think he's the one that came across that way. It is not an uplifting message by any means. And keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, all this is happening right now when now you have the Democrats that are looking at getting rid of Title 42. This was put in place during the pandemic to limit the amount of those that were coming across the southern border seeking asylum. And it worked. Right now, they're looking to roll this thing back in roughly a month. They're expecting the border crossings to go up to almost 18,000 additional per day. Keep in mind, we're getting a spike in COVID right now. The whole reason that Trump implemented this thing was as a response to the pandemic. And right now, you're seeing it, especially in Washington, D.C. Nancy Pelosi herself coming down last week with the new variant of COVID. The governor of Texas, this soundbite you've probably heard, and I'm going to play it in 1 second, but his press conference went on for about an hour, and what he was speaking of is the impact that unbridled illegal immigration, and by the way, real quick, have you noticed that the conversation has changed from immigration to migration? Has anybody else noticed that? And it just kind of happened in the middle of the night. All of a sudden, we got off of immigration. Legal immigration, illegal immigration. We're not using the I word anymore. We're using migration. And it's a huge difference. Because migration is people that are escaping from somewhere that they are just sort of transitioning through versus wanting to immigrate to a place to become an American citizen. Not demonizing these people. And there are a lot of horrific places on the planet. And I can understand why they want to bring themselves and their families to America. This is a conversation this country has been having for 40 years. In the mid-'80s, Ronald Reagan cut a similar deal that Bush was trying to cut back in 2012, 2014. I don't exactly remember. But it was the promise of amnesty today, border security tomorrow. Reagan cut the same deal. He gave amnesty to roughly 5 million Americans back then with the promise of border security tomorrow. It never happened. George Bush tried to retouch on it. Obama, a total disaster in this category. And the only president to actually get serious on it was Donald Trump. And the reality is, however the media may frame this, majority of Americans, they want secure borders. They do believe, as Ronald Reagan said, a nation without borders is not a nation. And they do understand, because most Americans have common sense, despite what we're taught, they do understand that southern border states, this affects them differently. It affects California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, different than Montana. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. And what Governor Abbott was talking about earlier in the week was the issues and the challenges that he is having in Texas. Keep in mind, he is the governor of Texas, so his fiduciary responsibility lies within that state. Governor earlier last week. Go.
Whose communities are being overwhelmed by hordes of illegal immigrants who are being dropped off by the Biden administration. Texas is providing charter buses to send these illegal immigrants who have been dropped off by the Biden administration to Washington, D.C. We are sending them to the United States Capitol, where the Biden administration will be able to more immediately address the needs of the people that they are allowing to come across our border.
Well, look, he was demonized on that as it coming across as being racist, the way everything is. What Governor Abbott was talking about was there is going to be a financial cost to this. Is there a little showmanship in there? Absolutely. Now, a soundbite or part of that press conference that did not get a whole lot of attention was he also talked about stopping every vehicle that would be coming north across the border. The reason for that is coyotes and unsafe vehicles that are being used to transport illegal immigrants. We're no longer talking about asylum. We're talking about the mass influx of illegal immigrants. A lot of them are bad players. They're all undocumented. Basically, with the new asylum practices, it's basically another version of catch and release. And what the governor was preparing residents in Texas for was traffic is going to get real backed up real quick. because we are going to be stopping every vehicle coming across the southern border. Not to prove a point as the way he's been framed on the we're going to send everybody to Washington, D.C., but he's doing it for the security and safety of his citizens in Texas. And for those that live on the southern border, they've seen what a disaster and what the impact has been on communities along that southern border. And who's being criticized for this? Not Joe Biden, who is opening the floodgates, who is regressing on the improvements that Donald Trump did do. It's the governor of Texas for standing up and representing, of all people that live in Texas. Pretty novel idea, isn't it? And again, majority, even Democrats right now, okay, moderates like Joe Manchin, they are concerned about rolling back Title 42. They realize the influx, the tidal wave of undocumented illegal immigrants in this country that right now is fiscally hurting. There's no question about that. Between supply chains, hyperinflation, stagnant wages. And here's the kicker of the whole thing, ladies and gentlemen. If Texas were to get the money they need to meet the needs that Texas will be faced in a month, 2 months with the rollback of Title 42, where would that money come from? It would come from the federal government. That would then indebt them to the federal government. And one thing we've proven time and time again, when you get large amounts of money, usually it comes with some stipulations behind it. Ladies and gentlemen, Delegate Dan Cox was scheduled to join the program today. We had to push him to next week, so we're very much looking forward to having Mr. Cox. He'll be joining us for one of our segments. Had the pleasure, I didn't get really a chance to talk to him too much, but I had a chance of hearing him speak about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I'll tell you what, I think he's one of the better voices in Maryland right now when it comes to the direction that this Republican Party needs to take. And he is standing by his core values. He understands what conservatism is. He's not shying away from it. And that is a novel idea these days in politics, and especially here in the state of Maryland. Again, ladies and gentlemen, please, you can check out current shows, past shows at jimmymathislive.com. It will also link you to all of our social media platforms. The Jimmy Mathis radio show podcast will now be available Monday through Friday around 7 a.m. You can get that on all of your normal sources for podcast. Also, past episodes of that and the current episode of the audio podcast will also be available on jimmymathislive.com. Everybody, always a pleasure being with you. Can't wait to be back next Sunday. Everybody have a great week, and I will see you next Sunday, same time, same place, here on the Jimmy Mathis Show. Have a great week, everybody.